So, having spoken about surveys and other perception-based indicators, we can see that in both cases we obviously sort of always have a bias. We always have a subjective bias that people have when we're talking about corruption, either because their personal perceptions are flawed or because their impression isn't the most comprehensive one, but also because the concepts of the corruption that people apply when they're asked also vary. So ideally, of course, we shouldn't rely on perception-based indices, but rather on objective data. And increasingly over the last years, researchers have been trying to get to objective indices that can measure or at least serve as proxies for corruption. The idea here really is to build more reliable indicators and also to be able to track change over time. Because as I highlighted when I spoke about composite expert scores, tracking change over time with them is really difficult. Because what we want when we track corruption and when we measure corruption is not only to understand the nature of corruption and the different factors that influence it, but also be able to assess success of anti-corruption reforms and try and see what over time influences the levels of corruption in a country, in a region, or in a sector. So basically, researchers have been focusing on three different types of objective data. So they have looked at process-based data, so basically looked at irregularities in governance that are associated with corrupt outcomes. Then they have looked at outcomes in order to assess corruption, so actually the distribution of public goods and how it's seen as corrupt, or how we can derive that there's corruption from these outcomes. And then they have looked at regulatory frameworks. So basically, they have associated corrupt outcomes with specific legal or societal arrangements. One indicator which was already developed in 2005, which I want to talk about, is a proposal by Golden and Piquet, who proposed a measure for corruption that looks at infrastructure. So basically, the measure that they suggested looks at the amounts of physically existing infrastructure in a region, so roads, schools, hospitals, etc., and then the amounts of money that was cumulatively allocated by governments in order to create these. The theory is quite easy. The calculation behind it is a bit more difficult, but the theory is quite easy. It says that basically, if you spend more money on infrastructure, we also should see more infrastructure in the end. So Golden and Piquet produced this index for 20 Italian regions in the mid-90s, and they basically calculated two scores. One score that assessed the existence of public infrastructure, and another score that accumulated public infrastructure spending. They used this as a measure of grand administrative corruption, and it's based, as I said before, as one of the examples, it's based on outcomes, so on the outcome of a governance process. In the end, they subtracted with the calculation the two scores from one another, and they received a score which is shown in this map here on the slides. And this map really sort of, as you can see quite easily, like it shows, like it's one of the things that I mentioned earlier, that corruption in the different regions in Italy actually differs quite a lot, and that some regions in the south of Italy are considerably more corrupt than regions in the north of Italy. So obviously this is an imperfect approach because you need all this data to be available, and it's quite complicated. Also, tracking it over time can be tricky, but it's definitely an objective score that is not influenced by expert biases. What goes in a similar direction is the Public Expenditure Tracking Survey, which is conducted by the World Bank, which is quite popular in donor-receiving countries, and also, I think in some cases in Ukraine, these were used. Basically, look at public spending and track how this spending actually reaches people on the ground and actually creates infrastructure, for example. Another survey I want to highlight is one by Escresa and Piquet that was published in 2017 in a paper. It's the Public Administration Corruption Index. It is based, rather than on infrastructure or similar things, it's based on court cases. So it looks at companies that were caught bribing public officials and prosecuted based on laws such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I don't know if you're aware of this. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act already exists in the United States since the 1970s, and it basically makes bribing public officials abroad illegal in the United States. So you can, which is quite uncommon because you can prosecute a company or subsidiary that is headquartered in the United States for violating laws abroad, which is uncommon for a crime. But these laws now exist in actually several other countries, especially since the adoption of the OECD Bribery Convention. And so increasingly we have a log of cases where companies that are headquartered in mostly Western countries were received fines, or at least were tried in court for bribing public officials in third countries. So the two factors that Skresa and Picky took into account when creating the Public Administration Corruption Index were the number of cases that involved companies with an HQ in a certain country, and then also cases that involved companies bribing a case in the respective country. So they basically took both sides of the equation. So how many cases are known of companies bribing officials in this specific country, and how many companies from this country were caught bribing abroad. The calculation is well thought through and actually gives some quite interesting results. It also sort of makes up for a deficiency of many corruption expert indices, but at the moment it still suffers from a lack of an adequate number of cases. So while this is an interesting index and definitely an interesting approach, we cannot really use it that widely yet to have a solid measure for corruption.